Good evening. Tonight, I want to talk about something small that a lot of people overlook: what you eat in the hour or two before bed. It's an easy thing to dismiss. We spend so much energy thinking about breakfast, about lunch, about whether we're eating enough vegetables during the day, that the last meal or snack before sleep barely gets a second thought. But there's a growing body of research suggesting that what happens in your body overnight, how well you sleep, how your brain clears waste, how it consolidates the day's memories, is shaped in part by what you put into it in those final waking hours. I want to be upfront. I'm not a physician, and nothing here is medical advice. I'm also not here to sell you a supplement or a miracle fix. What I am going to do is walk you through 5 ordinary foods, the kind you can find in almost any grocery store, that keep showing up in nutrition and sleep research when it comes to brain health, particularly for people over 60. I'll tell you what the evidence actually shows, where it's strong, and where it's still early or uncertain. Honesty matters more than excitement here. If you're managing a health condition, taking medication, or have dietary restrictions, please talk to your own doctor before making changes to your evening routine. Nothing here should replace that conversation. With all of that said, let's get into it. 5 foods. Counting down from 5 to 1, ranked roughly from helpful to most supported by the research. Let's start with something a little unexpected: tart cherry juice, specifically from Montmorency cherries. Most of us think of cherries as a summer fruit, something sweet you'd put in a pie or eat by the handful in July. But tart cherries are nutritionally different from the sweet cherries you'd usually snack on. They're one of the few food sources that naturally contain melatonin, the hormone your body produces to help regulate your internal clock and signal that it's time to sleep. They're also rich in a class of plant compounds called anthocyanins, which give the cherries their deep red color and appear to have anti-inflammatory properties throughout the body. Here's what the research actually shows. A handful of clinical studies, some in older adults specifically, have looked at what happens when people drink tart cherry juice in the evening for several weeks. The general pattern is a modest improvement in sleep duration and sleep quality, and in a few studies, some improvement in markers related to inflammation. I want to be careful with the word modest, because that's really what the data supports. This isn't a dramatic intervention. It's a small nudge in a helpful direction. Why does that matter for brain health specifically, rather than just sleep? Deep, uninterrupted sleep is when your brain does much of its heavy lifting for memory consolidation, sorting through the day's experiences and deciding what to file away. Anything that modestly improves sleep quality indirectly supports that process. It's not that tart cherry juice does something magical to your neurons directly. It's that better sleep tends to support better next-day cognitive function. If you want to try it, here's a sensible approach. Look for a label that specifically says Montmorency tart cherry, not just cherry juice or cherry juice cocktail, since sweet cherry varieties don't have the same composition. Go for unsweetened or minimally sweetened versions where you can find them. A juice loaded with added sugar is likely to work against whatever benefit you're going for. A small glass, somewhere around 6 to 8 ounces, an hour or so before bed is a reasonable starting point, and there's no strong evidence that more is better here. This is a consistent small habit food, not a more is more food. Next up is something already sitting in most people's refrigerators: Greek yogurt. The reason it's worth a mention isn't really about the calcium, although that matters plenty for older adults on its own. It's really about 2 things: the protein content and something called tryptophan. Tryptophan is an amino acid that your body uses through a multi-step process to eventually produce serotonin, and from there, melatonin. It's tempting to think, so eating tryptophan-rich foods will make me sleepy. But I want to be honest that the science here is more modest than headlines suggest. A single serving isn't going to flood your system with sleep hormones. The pathway is real but slow and affected by a lot of other factors. What's more solidly supported is this: choosing a protein-rich, low-sugar snack in the evening is simply a better choice than a sugary one for reasons that go beyond tryptophan. A sugary snack before bed can spike your blood sugar and then cause it to crash a few hours later, which can actually disrupt sleep and wake you up in the middle of the night. Greek yogurt avoids that problem while giving you a reasonably satisfying protein-forward option. There's also a broader point about protein and aging that's worth mentioning. As we get older, our bodies become somewhat less efficient at using dietary protein to maintain and repair muscle, something researchers sometimes describe as a kind of protein resistance that develops with age. Greek yogurt's protein digests relatively slowly compared to, say, a whey protein shake, which some researchers think may make it a reasonably good option for sustained amino acid availability overnight. I'll say plainly that the specific claim that this protein availability directly repairs synaptic connections overnight is more speculative extrapolation than settled science. But the broader idea that adequate protein intake supports healthy aging, including brain health indirectly through overall metabolic and vascular health, is well established. If you want to give it a try, a serving of plain full-fat Greek yogurt, the full-fat version rather than fat-free, since some nutrients absorb better alongside a bit of fat, is a reasonable evening snack, maybe with a small handful of blueberries stirred in for some extra polyphenols and a bit of natural sweetness. I'd suggest skipping the granola, honey clusters, or other high-sugar toppings that often come with flavored yogurts, since those work against the blood sugar stability benefit you're going for. Something in the neighborhood of 45 minutes to an hour before bed is a reasonable window, third on the list, and one that surprises people because it seems almost too simple. Walnuts. Not mixed nuts in general, walnuts specifically stand out here for a fairly concrete biochemical reason. Walnuts are the only tree nut that contains a meaningful amount of alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA, a plant-based omega-3 fatty acid. Your body can convert some ALA into DHA, the fatty acid that makes up a significant portion of your brain's structural fat, the material that forms the membranes around your neurons, and the connections between them. I want to flag an important caveat here, though. That conversion process from ALA to DHA becomes markedly less efficient as we age, which is part of why direct dietary sources of DHA and EPA, which I'll get to when we talk about fatty fish, matter more the older we get. Walnuts alone can't fully make up that gap. What does the research actually show about walnuts and cognition? A number of large observational studies, the kind that follow thousands of people over years and look for patterns, rather than controlled experiments, have found that people who regularly eat nuts, including walnuts, tend to score better on cognitive tests than people who rarely eat them. This is a consistent pattern across multiple cohorts, which is part of why researchers take it seriously. But it's worth being precise. An association doesn't prove walnuts alone are responsible. People who eat more nuts often have other health-conscious habits too, more activity, less processed food overall, and it's genuinely hard to fully separate those factors. Still, walnuts contain polyphenols and antioxidants with their own plausible rationale for supporting brain health, so most researchers consider them a reasonable, low-risk addition to a brain-healthy diet. As for timing and amount, a small handful, roughly an ounce, which works out to about 14 walnut halves, raw or dry roasted and unsalted, is a sensible portion. There's no strong evidence that eating them specifically before bed, rather than earlier in the day, makes a meaningful difference. The overnight window framing you sometimes hear is more speculative than proven, but working a small handful into your evening routine is a perfectly reasonable, low-effort habit, and pairing it with something like the Tart cherry juice we talked about earlier is a pleasant, simple combination, even if the synergy between them hasn't been rigorously studied together. Second on the list is one of the oldest foods used in an evening ritual: raw honey. Honey has a long history across many cultures as something taken before sleep, often stirred into warm milk or tea. Some of that is tradition rather than science, but there is a genuine, fairly straightforward piece of biology behind it that's worth understanding. A small amount of honey before bed can produce a gentle, modest insulin response. That may sound counterintuitive. Isn't spiking insulin before bed supposed to be a bad thing? But in small amounts, this modest response appears to help lower circulating cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, in the hours leading into sleep. Elevated nighttime cortisol has fairly well established links to poorer sleep quality and more fragmented sleep, and poor sleep, in turn, is consistently linked to worse next day memory performance and cognitive function. So the chain of reasoning here is honest and reasonably well supported. Less nighttime cortisol tends to mean better sleep, and better sleep tends to mean better cognitive function the next day. Where I want to be more careful is with some of the more dramatic claims you'll sometimes see about honey directly triggering new brain cell growth or reversing memory decline. There is early research, much of it in animal models or laboratory settings rather than in humans, looking at specific compounds found in raw honey and their effects on markers related to brain cell growth. That's genuinely interesting science, and it may turn out to matter a great deal, but it's not yet the kind of settled human trial-backed finding that I'd want to build a confident claim around. So I'll say it plainly. The helps regulate cortisol and modestly supports better sleep. Part of the honey story is reasonably solid. The directly grows new brain cells part is still early stage and shouldn't be oversold. What is well established, separate from anything specific to honey, is that a small amount of a natural sweetener is generally a better bedtime choice than refined sugar, especially for anyone managing blood sugar swings or working on general metabolic health. If you want to try this, look for raw, unfiltered honey where you can find it, ideally from a local source, since heavy processing and pasteurization can reduce some of the more delicate plant compounds naturally present in honey. 1 to 2 teaspoons is a reasonable amount. There's no evidence that more is better, and too much added sugar of any kind before bed can work against you. Stirring it into a warm, not boiling, herbal tea about 30 minutes before sleep is a pleasant, low-effort way to work it into an evening routine. And now, the food I genuinely put the most weight behind on this list: fatty fish. Wild-caught salmon, sardines, and mackerel in particular. I put this at number 1 deliberately because it's also the food people are often most hesitant about eating in the evening, usually because of old advice about cholesterol or a general sense that eating a fuller meal close to bedtime is a bad idea. I want to take a moment to walk through why the evidence here is actually some of the strongest and most consistent on this entire list. Fatty fish is the richest dietary source of preformed DHA and EPA, the 2 long-chain omega-3 fatty acids that aren't just generally healthy in a vague sense, but are literal structural components of your brain. Roughly 60% of your brain's dry weight is fat, and DHA specifically makes up a substantial share of that. It's a core building material for the membranes surrounding every neuron and every connection between them. This isn't a nutrient that works the way a vitamin might, providing a supporting role in some background process. It's closer to a raw material your brain is physically built from. Here's the aging-specific piece that makes this particularly relevant the older we get: your body's ability to convert plant-based omega-3s, the ALA found in walnuts and flaxseed that we talked about earlier, into the DHA your brain actually uses declines noticeably with age. That means that for a lot of people over 60, plant-based omega-3 sources alone may not be providing the level of DHA your brain could use, which is precisely why direct dietary sources like fatty fish become more important, not less, as we get older. Now, what does the actual research show? This is genuinely one of the more well-studied areas in nutritional neuroscience. Long-term studies that have followed groups of older adults for years, including well-known research out of Rush University in Chicago, as part of their broader work on memory and aging, and other similar cohort studies in the United States and Europe, have found a consistent pattern. People who eat fish regularly, generally once a week or more, tend to show slower rates of cognitive decline compared to people who eat fish rarely or never. Systematic reviews that pool the results of many such studies together have found similar patterns, particularly for processing speed, executive function, and certain kinds of memory. I want to be honest about the limits of this evidence too, the same way I was with walnuts. These are observational studies. They're genuinely valuable, and the pattern is remarkably consistent across different populations and research groups, which counts for something. But they can't fully rule out the possibility that people who eat more fish also tend to have other healthier habits overall, more regular exercise, better access to healthcare, different socioeconomic circumstances, and so on. Nutrition science, almost across the board, struggles with fully isolating single food effects from broader lifestyle patterns. That said, the strength, consistency, and sheer volume of research pointing toward fish and cognitive health is part of why fish shows up as a core component in nearly every well-studied brain-healthy dietary pattern, including the MIND diet, which was specifically developed and studied by researchers at Rush University, with cognitive health in older adults as the primary focus. As for the evening timing specifically, I want to be careful not to overstate this part. There's a plausible biological idea that your brain does a substantial amount of waste clearance and maintenance work during deep sleep, and that having adequate omega-3s circulating might support that process. It's a reasonable hypothesis, and there's some early research pointing in that direction, but I'd call this piece more theoretical than proven in humans at this point. What's much more solid is simply this. Getting fatty fish into your diet regularly, a couple of times a week, appears to matter for long-term cognitive health, and having it as a lighter evening meal is a perfectly reasonable way to fit it into your routine if that works better for your schedule than eating it earlier in the day. Fatty fish also happens to be a strong source of vitamin D, vitamin B12, and selenium, three nutrients that are commonly low in older adults, and all three of which play meaningful roles in nervous system function and overall cognitive health. B12 deficiency in particular is common enough in older adults that it's worth a mention on its own, and it's been linked in research to memory problems and mood changes, which is one more reason fatty fish earns its place at the top of this list. If you'd like to try this, a modest portion, somewhere around 4 ounces, of grilled or baked salmon, sardines, or mackerel, eaten as a light dinner a couple of hours before bed, is a reasonable way to work this into your week a few times over. There's no need to eat it every single night. Most of the research on cognitive benefits is based on once or twice weekly consumption, not daily intake. So don't feel pressure to overdo it. I want to end with something honest, because I think it matters more than another dramatic claim would. None of these 5 foods is a cure for memory loss or cognitive decline, and nothing here replaces the basics that we already know matter enormously. Good sleep habits, regular movement, staying fully and mentally engaged, managing stress, and getting proper medical care, especially if you're noticing changes in your memory that concern you. If that's something you're experiencing, please do bring it up with your doctor rather than trying to address it through diet alone. What I do think is true and worth acting on is that small, low-risk, evidence-informed changes to your evening routine are a reasonable thing to try. You don't need to overhaul your entire diet overnight. Pick one of these 5 foods, work it into your routine a few nights a week, and give it some time, a few weeks, not a few days, before deciding whether it's making a difference for you. And if none of it seems to change much, that's useful information too. Not every habit works the same way for every person, and that's simply the nature of nutrition science. It deals in patterns and probabilities across large groups of people, not guarantees for any one individual. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.